Hey there, it's Ina from Taproot Tarot, and I'm recording this on the day before the US release date of the new edition of the Crystal Tarot, or the Glass Tarot, by Elisabetta Trevisan. That comes out in the US on Wednesday, October 8th. And since I started my channel, I've been talking about wanting to do a video on the unique pip system that the Crystal Tarot uses, or the Glass Tarot. That pip system was developed in 1909 by Eudes Picard, and it's had a big influence on a number of other esoteric decks, such as Domenico Balbi's Tarot and El Gran Tarot Esoterico by Marseille. It's been a big influence on a number of other tarots as well. The Knapp Hall Tarot has pips with a similar shape that seem to be inspired by Eudes Picard. There's a rare tarot called the Magdalene Legacy Tarot, which uses Eudes Picard pips, and it looks really cool. It's difficult to get. It does have a book that comes with it. And I've seen a number of other pip decks that have definitely been influenced by Eudes Picard's work. So it's an important system to be aware of. And I think it's actually a really good system for learning any pip deck. It's really helpful. So I'm really excited to share it with you. Before I get to that, I want to mention that today was the release date of Tom Benjamin's book, The Modern Fortune Teller's Field Guide. And since I've been working on this video, I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but it looks really good. And I'll give you an update, but I'm excited to read that. But first, let's talk a little bit of history on the Crystal Tarot. This first came out as a 22 card majors only deck in 1990. So the backs. And it's inspired by Gustav Klimt. It was painted by Elisabetta Trevisan on glass with tempera paints. And later, in 1995, an edition with the Eudes Picard pips came out. It's had a few editions. This one is the most recent one, which came out in 2004. So it's been in print for over 20 years now. And tomorrow, the new edition will be coming out. The images will be much bigger, so there are no white borders on the sides. And these gaps here are expanded so that the labels can go there without taking away from the art. I believe the gaps are original to the artwork. I know some people don't like them, but I believe they're in all of the editions, so I believe those are original to Trevisan's work. Now, the original Italian is Tarocchi di Vetro, which is the Glass Tarot, or even the Stained Glass Tarot. And I think we call it Crystal Tarot in English just for marketing reasons. So in my mind, I like to think of it as the Glass Tarot. And it is truly beautiful. One thing I'm wondering about, in the original release, one of the cards was reversed, and I'm not sure which one. In this version, several cards are reversed from her original artwork. And that includes the Pope, Papess, the Chariot, Judgment, and the World. And you can tell which ones are reversed by looking at her signature. You can see right there that her signature is backwards. The only one where it's really an issue is the World card, which you can see is reversed right there. And that means that the four evangelicals are not in the order that we're accustomed to seeing them. Now, I'm not sure if the new edition is going to flip those around. Looking at the images on the Lo Scarabeo and Llewellyn websites, the only one I found that was reversed was the one that had been originally reversed. I don't remember off the top of my head which one that is. So I'm not sure if they reverted back to the original or if the World card and Judgment and all of those will be reversed again. It's only really unfortunate with the World card, otherwise it doesn't make a big difference, but just something to note. And when that comes out, I did pre-order it, so I will be receiving that deck. I pre-ordered from Thrift Books, so I probably won't get it tomorrow. Whenever I receive that, I will do a follow-up to this and a more detailed look at the whole deck, maybe a little bit more information on the Eudes Picard system if I miss anything today. But really today, we're not going to talk about the triumphs. We are going to focus on the pips because that was Eudes Picard's focus. This is a book printed by Christine Payne Towler, and colorized by her husband, who's an artist. I'm not sure if it's available anymore. She does have a website, so it might be worth emailing her. But last I checked, it wasn't for sale on her site anymore. Eudes Picard's main focus for the triumphs was to assign astrological symbols to them. He did write a book about his tarot deck and described all of the triumphs and his astrological associations. If you follow my channel, you know I don't really layer on astrology or other esoteric symbolism onto the tarot. So that makes it a little easier for me to interpret cards like this, because I really don't worry about those. I worry more about the archetypal and art history symbolism in the cards. This deck is accompanied by a book written by Christine Payne-Towler. She's a tarot philosopher, I would say. And she makes the point in here that Eudes Picard's astrological associations aren't organized enough to really be a system. And that works for the way I interpret cards. So they're in there as for their symbolic meaning, but not really layered on as an esoteric system necessarily. When it comes to his drawings of the triumphs, they are pretty rudimentary. I've mentioned this before. And you can tell based on this art that the triumphs weren't his main concern, because he really is mostly using the traditional Marseille symbolism. This is one of the exceptions. He's added some symbolic elements to the Empress. But for the most part, it's pretty straightforward Marseille imagery. And you can tell that he kind of phoned it in for these, because once you get to his pips, you see that he is indeed, was indeed an accomplished artist. And his pips are really beautiful. Now, they never were colorized. He made 50 decks in black and white to accompany his book. Now, his book, until recently, was not available in English. And in fact, in Christine Payne-Towler's book, she even says, if only somebody would come out with a full translation of Eudes Picard's book. And this one came out in May of 2022. And lo and behold, in June of 2022, we got a really good translation of Eudes Picard's book. So she only needed to hold out for a little while longer and would have gotten to see this before releasing her book, but I have both, and they both have their benefits, so I will talk about that. Maricciugula's deck, El Gran Tarot Esoterico, which has art by Luis Peña Longa, has its own system in the triumphs, which are influenced by Maricciugula's own philosophy as well as by Eudes Picard. Now the pips are Eudes Picard pips, and so we'll be comparing those today. The really cool thing is that she would not have had access to the images of the deck because those were not present in Eudes Picard's book. So some of them you can tell were interpretations made by reading the text, and they're a little different from the imagery presented by Eudes Picard himself. So that's interesting. Vintage copies of El Gran Tarot Esoterico do come with Maricciugula's guidebook, but unfortunately Fournier has, gone the route of just making generic guidebooks for all their tarots. That includes all of Maricciugula's old decks, which even the ones that are still in print. Now, I was able to get my hands on a copy of one of her standalone guidebooks for the Great Esoteric Tarot. You can see that matches the back here. I'll talk a little bit about the benefits of this book as well. It was a little pricey, this on its own. I think vintage copies of El Gran Tarot Esoterico are gettable, and I'm not an expert on vintage decks, but I would guess that if the outside of the box says by Maricciugula, or if the guidebook itself does, then that would be her guidebook, rather than this one, which is the generic one that comes with all Fournier decks. I do also plan to do a video on Maricciugula. I've read up on her history quite a bit, and she's a really interesting figure in tarot history, and I really like her writing. Her decks are pip decks too, so I have, as far as I know, I have all of them that she published through Fournier, and I'll definitely show you those at some point. And I do also have this book on her deck. This book gets really philosophical, and it's really interesting, very esoteric. So a lot of it is stuff that's not super interesting to me, but philosophically I do find it really interesting. It focuses entirely on the triumphs though, so we won't be talking about this today. I will be getting that out for you once I do a video on Mariciu Gula. The next tarot I'll be talking about is the Tarot Balbi by Domenico Balbi. He and his daughter wrote a tarot book together in Italian. There are English translations out there, but I have not been able to find one that was affordable for me. Not even close. And I've also not been able to find a very usable version of this deck. This version is the original 1978, and it's gorgeous, but it's very brittle, possibly due to age, maybe even water damage, I'm not sure. But I wouldn't want to use these. I think it would chip and crack if I tried to put it to use. There was a mass market edition of it that came out in the 90s, and I'd really love a copy of that. So one of these days, I've been keeping my eye out for one. I am, like I've mentioned though, no buy until January, which has been really nice to focus on my current decks, but I still have pre-orders and Kickstarters and stuff coming in. As you can see though, this has been influenced quite a bit by not just Eudes Picard's work, but also by Mariciu Gula's work. This Baphomet style devil she refers to as Aker, which is a Basque concept that I'll talk about when I discuss her work. But again, we will be talking about the pips today. If you are really interested in the details of reading this pip system, I for sure recommend at least one of these books. They each have their benefits, and I will let you know what I think about each one of them. My number one recommendation would be Eudes Picard's own work. This one is an excellent translation with very few notes from the translator, very little context or history. That is one benefit of Christine Payne-Towler's book, is that she does provide some history and context. Now, a lot of that is her own philosophy on what she refers to as Spanish continental tarot tradition, which includes Eudes Picard, even though he is a French tarot reader and writer. But she has her reasons for including him in this tradition, and it has mostly to do with the astrological associations. Again, that's not something I get very deep into. But there's a lot of good information in her book. And I believe this one, at least the black and white version, is readily available still. The color version is really nice, a little more pricey. But especially if you can't get this deck, I definitely recommend the color version. Although, like I said, the Eudes Picard decks were not colorized. And those were almost lost to history. While the book did survive, I'm not sure that any of the card decks did. Perhaps they are available somewhere, but the wood blocks that were used for printing the cards were lost until 2012, and somebody found them at a flea market and made a limited print run of them, and from there these pips were kind of rediscovered. So that's interesting that the glass tarot pips, all of these were made without examples of the cards themselves, presumably just from the writing of Eudes Picard. All three of these books unfortunately give individual meanings for the pips instead of delineating a system for reading them. In other words, the meaning of the suits with the meaning of the numbers, along with the symbolism contained in each card. That means you kind of have to memorize the meanings of each individual card, which I'm not into that. So as I read through this though, I could tell he was using the traditional method of reading pips, which is to blend the symbolism of the suit with the symbolism of the number, and then adding additional symbolic imagery. And so I took notes and kind of figured out the symbolism he was using, and I plan to type that up in my description. I've just got a list of his meanings for not just the suits, but the numbers, as well as some of the imagery elements in his cards, which I think is a much more useful way to learn to read pips, especially if you aren't interested in the super complicated esotericism and all of that. So let's go through these, and I'll just talk a little bit about some of that imagery and symbolism. Scepters represent action and are associated with fire and the 3 fire signs. In his original book, Picard says that the scepter is surmounted by an orb, which we see here. Mariciu Gula interpreted that as hanging from a globe. So that's why we see what looks like a balloon, but is apparently a globe of some kind. holding the scepter up. Now, he does not have a suit associated with the intellect, but talks about intellect throughout all the suits, and the scepters seem to represent more like a genius type intellect or very active mind. And all of the aces represent the principal or foundational aspect of the suit. He considers the scepters to be one of the beneficial suits, along with the cups, whereas the coins and swords are malicious, and so whatever the symbolism of the number, if that can be interpreted in a positive or negative way, with the scepters it's going to tend to be interpreted in a positive way. Both grain and fruit, here we have wheat and grapes, symbolize fertility or a product, and twos represent duality either in the form of partnership or opposition, and we see that here represented by both the flames and the vapors. The dog, caduceus, and hazel branches are all representative of Mercury. The threes all seem to have the theme of evolution or development, transformation, and are represented by triangles, although that interpretation was a little different here in the Balbi Tarot. And it's really similar to the common meaning that we would have, the beginning of the development, so coming together to create something. He does associate the three of scepters with intellect. The four, as you might suspect, represents stability of the sturdy square. The lion represents support or strength. And the checkerboard represents planning and organization. So the four really represents making something materialize or realization of a concept. In this case, an intellectual concept. The wheat is referred to as corn, which in earlier European translations just means any grain. So the fives were difficult for me to figure out his concept. And he does say in his intro that he uses Kabbalistic number meanings, which I wasn't really seeing that. I'm definitely not an expert in the numerical meanings in the Kabbalah, but I wasn't really seeing those line up with, the meanings he was giving in the book. So this is where the beneficial and malicious differentiation is important, because the five seem to either be self-restraint or control or prudence, or excess if it's malicious. It can be either triumph over something or something dominating you. I came to that conclusion and then realized, well, he's associating that with the fives in the Marseille, which are the Pope 5 and the Devil 15. Then that totally made sense. So where the Pope is, the triumph of the spiritual over the material, and the devil is the material dominating you. And which meaning you use kind of depends on whether you choose one of the beneficial suits or if it's one of the malicious suits. This one being a beneficial suit. And this is an example. He does mention that that's not always the case. So for his 5 of scepters, he does say it's ambition and spirit of intrigue, but also irritability, anger, and alcohol. So, the answer is it depends. But this is definitely symbolizing an excess. And he does note that to him, reversals do not change the meaning of the card. They might weaken the meaning of the card, or even put the astrological meaning in retrograde. So I thought that was interesting. So it doesn't necessarily reverse the meaning. And you can see where the Balbi is really deviating from the others. And then the others have different shapes simply because they didn't have access to Picard's deck, but just his text. And so it's really interesting to see how the different aspects are interpreted. The Balbi Tarot is still considered to be a part of the Picard pip system, though. And this is our first glimpse of larva. And that is one thing I want to note about Christine Payne Towler's book, that her interpretations of the triumphs come from a translation she found of somebody else's interpretation of Eudes Picard's work. So those aren't going to match up entirely. They actually have a little bit more depth to them. They do come from Picard, but indirectly through another writer. The pip definitions she has in here are from Eudes Picard, but prior to there being an English translation. So I believe her pip definitions were translated by a browser or, otherwise a digital translation, not by a person. And so she refers to the larvae as ghosts, which I can only assume is a mistranslation. And I'm sure there are others. I didn't, comb through and compare side by side both of those books. But that's just something to be aware of, that her meanings weren't necessarily translated by a human, and so that often leads to mistranslations like the larva being referred to as ghosts. And I have no idea how that mistranslation happened. I actually looked into it and tried to find what word could have been confused for ghosts, but I'm really not sure. Just something to be aware of, though, if you do get Christine Payne Towler's book. Now you can see the shapes of the sixes are two triangles, so it's nice and balanced. And it can represent opposition or balance, but also hesitation or having to make a decision. The larvae represent both decay and destruction here, where they're chewing on the roots, and also transformation, with this one about to emerge from the ground. Here he says that this is an opposition of two active principles, so the scepters being active, one that vivifies or provides life, that being the sun, and one that destroys, those being the larvae. Now his meaning is a little cartomantic. It says an alternative of laziness and work in business. So that's one downside of Eudes Picard's book, is that it's kind of difficult sometimes to see where he came up with the meaning. And that's something nice that Christine Payne Towler provides, is a little bit more depth. She provides a meaning that uses Aristotle's 10 characteristics, I think they're called. Aristotle's 10 categories of being. So that's not original to Picard, but it's kind of interesting and useful. I did find an article on Aristotle's 10 categories of being, and I will link that in the description. So she provides her translation of Eudes Picard at the top, which again has its problems, but then she further develops a translation here. One could see the below ground part as the past, haunted with regrets and setbacks. Now that haunted is coming from the mistranslation of ghosts. Alternatively, the above ground portion speaks of future potential ripening under the sun. So this might not be the best example because of the part about the ghost, but I will bring her book out again to give you another example. While we're at it though, Maricciugula's text is much more the text of an experienced tarot writer. She wrote a bunch of books for Fournier. She's got her methods that are actually really useful. So six scepters arranged in two triangles, which are opposite each other. One triangle has its apex toward the sky, whilst the apex of the other is pointing toward the ground. The roots of some wheat tassels planted in the ground are covered in larvae. A setting sun shines on the horizon. Divinatory significance. When the card is drawn right way up, periods of alternating hard work and idleness. Efforts being rewards, contentment to workers, and the exhibition of a work of art. Progress is made. When the card is drawn upside down, transitory success. Others give poor service, disloyalty, a venture fails. So that makes a lot of sense. And it just shows kind of the brilliance of Maricciugula, because she had access to this text and was able to translate it. And so his meaning is alternative of laziness and work in business. But hers aligns with that, but is much more detailed. So all three of these books in combination really make a great guide to these pips. It's a little unfortunate that there isn't like a comprehensive guide combining all of that information. Here we have the four elements represented, and I think it's very cool that Maricciugula and the artist Luis Peña Longa represented that with the elemental symbols instead of the more astrological symbols of air. I think that eagle is associated... Oh, Tammy Pie told me which one this is. It's one of the air suits. And then Aries for fire, crustacean for Cancer or water, and Taurus for earth. We get that too in the Tarot Balbi, even though they interpreted the shapes differently. We have 4 signs representing each of the elements. We don't have that so much in the Crystal Tarot, as far as I can tell. And the shape is a little different too. The basic meaning of the 7 is victory or success, and you can kind of see that in the number 7 card, which is the Chariot, represented by, you know, the stability of the 4 or the elements. Here, supporting the development of ideas. So the triangle around the sun represents spirit or invention. It's the light that dominates the material world, indicating the supremacy of the spirit over the elements. Now, the Crystal Tarot does something a little different, where it takes the symbolism from the 3. We have the hazel shoots, the caduceus, and the dog, which represent Mercury, and are a little clearer here in the original. And it keeps those elements and just adds 4 additional batons. And that kind of continues for more of the pips in the Crystal Tarot too. So not necessarily all of these will be represented in the Crystal Tarot, but I really think even without the symbolism, you can really blend the suit meanings with the number meanings and then use the images to read these kind of intuitively if you're already familiar with reading pips. So here again, it's repeating the symbolism from the 3 in the Crystal Tarot. And you can see where the interpretation was a little bit different based on the writing for Maricciugula's deck, and probably for Balbi's deck as well. Although you can see Balbi does have the vapors or steam above and the fire below. Another deck that is clearly pretty influenced by Eudes Picard's work is the Thoth Tarot. And this is one example. You can see the similarity in shape, as well as the, you know, representation of kind of an airier symbol above with the rainbow here instead of vapors. But the 8s in general symbolize balance and justice. And you can see that balance represented here. So he considers both fire and air to be intellectual faculties, whereas fire is the more passionate genius, which is tempered here by reason. And this balance also represents, you know, favorable conditions for life and growth. Eudes Picard was influenced by the tradition of reading the Marseille pips by including the botanical elements and noticing their growth. And so he talks about how his pips are intended to represent that natural development using naturalistic elements in a way that's a little more visually clear than the Marseille pips. So 9s are really interesting because we have the stability of the 4 or the square down below, and that is further symbolized by the lantern from the Hermit, which represents prudence. The pentagram of the 5 represents triumph or domination, which is supported by the structure of the 4. And so for Eudes Picard, 9 seems to represent the concept of the suit, which is fully formed or developed, something that has taken a lot of time to develop, something that's well thought out. It can also signify a delay. In the Crystal Tarot, you can kind of see that the triumph of the pentagram being hemmed in by the structure of the 4 instead of being supported by it. So that's interesting as well. Now the 10s take the 9s one step further beyond something that's been well developed to excess or a complexity to the point of instability. This can be, you know, overabundance, passion for maybe too many different areas of expertise, rather than focusing your efforts and using them more wisely. The Crystal Tarot does deviate quite a bit, as does the Tarot Balbi. I won't get into too much detail in the quartz because the meanings are pretty typical, but I'll talk a little bit about some of the symbolic elements. The fire is just there to remind us of the fiery elements, according to Picard's book. And he's planting his scepter in the ground, maybe being too reliant on structures that have already been set before him, and maybe even being entangled by the branches. And you can see the branches entangling a little bit in the Crystal Tarot and the Tarot Balbi. This is supposed to be a very typical night, very action-oriented, riding straight into the fire in this case. The Queen stands on top of an arrow, the symbol of Sagittarius, which represents education here. And it's pointed into the ground, so it's grounded as well. Interestingly, in the Tarot Balbi, her arrow is in a medallion instead of her standing upon it. And I like the inclusion of the checkerboard in the Crystal Tarot, which Eudes Picard uses to represent planning and strategy. I think that makes sense for this one. And here, the king standing upon the lion, which represents strength and power. And represented here a little less literally by the Tarot Balbi. And he's supposed to be somebody who's worked hard and is self-made. Now, Mardi-Chu Gula's text does specifically mention the window, which is protected by a wrought iron grille. I'm not sure if that is a translation error or if that's just an element that she added, because Eudes Picard's text says a king standing on a lion with a scepter in his hand, behind him a railing decorated with the attributes of the fire trine serves as a wall. Around him flames rise into the air. This card represents the power acquired through work and activity. It is suitable for men who have risen through their own merit, meaning great inventors, merchants, artists, and scholars, men of genius. So yeah, I think something about the railing in the wall must have been translated by Mardi-Chu Gula as this grate in front of a window. I think that's interesting. But we have maybe even a more specific image of a railing over a wall in the Crystal Tarot. So this text was definitely used. And then we have the fire symbol on the railing. And now we're to coins. According to Eudes Picard, coins represent money and nothing more. So all of his definitions really do have to do pretty literally with money. Elementally, they are earth and represented by all of the earth astrological symbols. And as with all of the aces, the ace is the fundamental and most basic principle of that suit. Coins are one of the malicious suits. So oftentimes, but not always, if there is the possibility of either a positive or negative meaning, the coin is going to be negative more often than not. I find his meanings to vary on that a little bit more than with some of the other suits, though. So here matter is constrained and trapped by the earth element, represented by roots. But his meaning for it is just money, in the broadest sense, as a value representative of matter. So twos are opposition, partnership, or antagonism. You can see the earth and moon representing more dark and weighty aspect, whereas the sun suspended by some eagles is more light. One aspect here is trapped by the roots. Interesting how the Crystal Tarot and Tarot Balbi all use the same earth sign that Picard uses, whereas Mardi-Chu Gula uses the more modern earth symbol. It's a pretty standard meaning for a two of coins, a business partnership or contract. So here we've got Taurus representing struggle, and his Capricorn symbol is a little different and is apparently, according to Christine Payne Towler, influenced by Arabic cosmology. So Taurus being struggle, Capricorn being work, and Virgo represents the benefit of this effort. And the larva here about to emerge from the ground represents transformations. Work and effort and struggle, representing kind of feeling stuck and entrapped, but then being released. Gaining some benefit from your efforts. And he simplifies the meaning as the beginning of a business relationship, so pretty similar to the two of coins, but maybe a little more complex. So this is about the earthiest card in the deck. So we've just got all the earth symbols. We've got the very sturdy 4 with the coins and the earth in the middle, along with Capricorn, Taurus, and Virgo, plus the checkerboard, which represents structure here. 4 of coins is pretty much just earth upon earth. 4s represent realization or something coming into material being. So that benefit or fortune that was represented by the 3rd coin in the last one is being realized here in the 4. So the materialization of a fortune. And he's got some, again, more random cartomantic meanings. I think this one is also the birth of a girl. So again, 5s represent something being dominated or acted upon or triumphed over. And here, your fortune is being subdued by reason. And he really does, like I said, equate all of the different suits with the intellect in different ways. I believe the ants represent industriousness. And overall, this card means greed, which I guess, you know, your reason can get the best of you when deciding how to manage your fortune. This one has some really cool symbolism. Remember, the 6s are a choice or indecision. They can also be hesitation. And here we've got the 3 theological virtues. The heart is charity, which, remember, in terms of the theological virtues, is not the same as magnanimity or generosity. It means putting the love of the divine over love for yourself, which can result in generosity, but it's not, especially when we're talking about money, but it's not quite the same thing. The cross represents faith, and the anchor is hope. And down below, we've got all Capricorns, which represent evil. As a Capricorn, I'm a little offended. This is the attempt of good ways to use your money, as opposed to evil ways to use your money. It's the alternating between generosity and greed. And you can kind of see that greed is symbolized by, the entrapment of the earth, whereas it's being released into the air in the more generous half. Oh, and interestingly, it might look like Maricugula has not included these symbols, but she has. They're just inside of the star. So you can see the 3 Capricorns there, as well as, it looks like a cross, an anchor, and a heart. Yep, so she has included that symbology. It's just a little harder to see. And more abstract here in the Crystal Tarot. And for her, she points this out as the theological struggle between good and evil, the fluctuations between miserliness and generosity, the good and the bad use of money. And when it's upside down, a disputed inheritance, which is a very cartomantic subject matter. Loans of money are not honored, egoism, greed, overambitiousness, selfishness, lack of balance between willpower and actions, envy. So just a reminder that the reversals come from Maricugula, but Eudes Picard didn't believe that reversals necessarily changed the meaning of the card. These symbols weren't spelled out as well in Eudes Picard's book, but they are in Christine Payne Towler's book. So here we have the Sun, Moon, and Jupiter. And here Mars, Venus, Mercury, and Saturn, and the Earth here. And you can see both El Gran Tarot Esoterico and the Tarot Balbi stick to that pretty well, whereas the Crystal Tarot gets a little more abstract. Remember, 7s are victory and success. And we've got the transformative aspect of the 3 supported by the structure of the 4. And he says this card represents the moral force of money and its rational use, and the meaning is benevolence. So remember, the 8s are balance, and here we have mirror images. So it's balance above and below, as well as to the left and right. This is a sun, and this is a little bit different. Possibly another sun interpretation. But then we have 2 caduceus symbols on either side, 2 Virgos, and 2 Capricorns. So very earthy down below, and more mercurial and vital up above. A little misinterpretation of the star shape with MALICIOUS' deck, and a more abstract interpretation with the Crystal Tarot, staying more on track with the Balbi, although not using quite the same symbols as the original. And this represents a fair distribution of wealth. So here we have the 5 domination over the stability or material of the 4. So this is acquisition or exploitation of land. This symbolism is switched up a little bit here in the Crystal Tarot, where we have 5.5 below the earth and 3.5 above. So again, 10s can be an overabundance or complexity to the point of instability. So here we have changing, unstable fortunes. With half of them above the earth and half below, it can be either gains or losses in money. Again, a pretty typical card meaning for Page of Coins. He doesn't have much money, but is ambitious for it and doesn't know how to handle it yet. There's Taurus inside the earth, here represented symbolically. And all of the Eudes Picard Knights contain a helmet. Typically it's somebody who more actively goes after money. I think gambler is one of the descriptions listed. This queen is surrounded by Virgos, represents somebody wealthy. And this king has Capricorns on his chair, pictured here on the MALICIOUS deck. Here he's holding some coins as well in his hand. Here holding one giant coin with an earth symbol on it. And a Capricorn symbol down here. And he's apparently made his fortune on barren ground with much difficulty. And he's kind of alone now. Here's another example of where the Thoth Tarot was probably influenced by Eudes Picard, where you can see various symbols, including the caduceus and planetary symbols on the coins, like many of the Eudes Picard coin cards. Next we have the Cups suit, and this is where people get a little confused by this system because the cups are associated with the element of air and swords with water. And you sometimes see the recommendation to read the cups as swords and the swords as cups, and I could not disagree more, and Eudes Picard definitely didn't have that intention. And keep in mind, he created this system at a time when elemental associations weren't as standardized as they are now. They are really kind of a more esoteric concept, and I actually don't emphasize them myself, which I feel like makes it easier for me to use a bigger variety of decks. So I use the suit symbols first and incorporate the elements if they're present as a secondary meaning. And Eudes Picard considers the cups to mean love, so definitely not interpreted as swords. And one benefit of Christine Payne Towler's book is that she writes a few paragraphs on her interpretation of how the cups could be air and the swords water. They don't quite align with Eudes Picard's original intent though, but they are pretty nice. She states that this reinterprets the chalice as the Holy Grail, not so much as a, sentimental symbol, but more as a meditative, contemplative, or divine symbol. So the more philosophical sphere of the mind. Now that is not Eudes Picard's interpretation. In fact, he considers the butterfly to represent sentimentality and the cup itself to represent love. And I have read somewhere that butterflies are symbolic of the psyche. And the psyche, one definition of the psyche is soul, which is another common meaning of a butterfly. But the psyche tends to combine emotions with intellect. And like I mentioned before, the intellect seems to be represented by all the suits in various ways in the Eudes Picard system. So you could even say that it's kind of artificial to separate emotions from thoughts. And the psyche represents the combination of both. Why he chose air to represent love. Honestly, they're, abstract symbols, and you can come up with reasons for that, for any of them, really. And again, this was a time before the elemental associations that are most popular now were standardized. So that was really all up in the air and up for discussion. So the ace here represents the fundamental principles of love, which go all the way from all of the air signs being represented down here: Aquarius, Libra, and Gemini, representing the more confused and agitated passions, that aspect of love. Whereas up here we have the more stable aspect of love represented by a castle or the home. And I think here in the Crystal Tarot, that's done even more beautifully as a community. So he says from these confused aspects emerges this strong and unbreakable family representation over which the butterfly hovers, a symbol of the soul, to guarantee the immortality of this stable love. And the Balbi Tarot includes all these elements as well, with the addition of a dove and placing the butterfly down below. And the eagles further representing air. He isn't too specific. He uses eagles a lot and doesn't specify what they mean to him. And you can see the eagles represented here in the Crystal Tarot in a more beautiful abstract way. And I can only guess that this basket in the Maricciu Gula deck was maybe due to a mistranslation, because otherwise she really does have all the other elements. So if anyone knows of a word for castle in French that sounds like basket in Spanish, let me know. And cups are a beneficial suit as opposed to a malicious suit, as you can imagine. And Christine Payne-Towler points out that the suit of cups really represents fine glasswork, which apparently Moorish artisans of the Iberian Peninsula were known for. And one of her premises is that these so-called Spanish continental tarots are more influenced by Arabic cosmology. And so she relates those two. And I'm not sure if that's true. Her work is often criticized as not being fact-based, but it's also very interesting philosophically. But that just makes me wonder, about the glass tarot, if that could have been inspired by the glasswork that Christine Payne-Towler says inspired Eudes Picard. Now, her deck initially didn't have these pips with it, so that's, just a random association. That may not be true. These roses represent Venus and love, and you can see they're represented by other flowers in the other cards, but Venus is symbolized here in Maricciu Gula's card. And the twos being a union of two, or opposition here in this case is a union. It can be the prospect of a union, or it can be an actual commitment or union if the surrounding cards are favorable. So he definitely encourages reading the cards as a group. So here the threes represent a new development or evolution. The egg represents a seed, and here symbolizes love on a physical level, which is transcended by the psyche or soul of the butterfly. The literal meaning in Eudes Picard's book is pregnancy. Maricciu Gula notes that the flowers, egg, and butterfly all represent the coming of spring, and that the central meaning is the growth of love. Her upright meanings are success, a heart ready for love, a satisfactory, joyful outcome, an engagement is certain, pregnancy, or when it's reversed, a slight setback in achieving success, overindulgence in pleasures, nevertheless a good card. And fours are the materialization of whatever the suit is, so the materialization of love here. Grain and fruit both represent a product or fertility. And we've got Gemini here. And Picard specifies an eagle breaking an egg, which he means, breaking out of an egg. But Marichu Gula here represents a little more literally. There's a beautiful eagle representation here with an egg surrounding it. Kind of looks like it's breaking out of it though. And this is the realization of life, birth. It can mean children. I think because of the Gemini symbol, he specifies it to the birth of a male child or animals. So this is supposed to be your feelings triumphing over reason. The owl here represents reason as well as prudence or discernment. It can be associated with the same symbolism as the hermit, similar to the lantern we saw earlier. So this might mean withdrawing from friendships or being more choosy with friendships. And when it comes to the symbolism of the triumphs showing up in the pips, and some of them having similar meanings, Picard specifies that the triumphs are causes and the pips and courts are effects. So they can have similar meanings but play a different role in a reading. So I really like Marichu Gula's interpretation, representing thoughtfulness at the center, and it could represent a loveless marriage, unpleasant and strong passions, betrayal by a loved one, self-denial, or being around unsavory company. But upside down, it's a more enjoyable get-together or good prospects. So here the cups form two triangles that are opposing each other. This one's surrounded by flowers, and this one's surrounded by butterflies and other air elements, eagles and other insects here. Sixes represent indecision or hesitation, in this case in the matter of love or over a marriage. So even though cups are love, the four, the square, represents something material. So we don't have a coin in this card, but we do have material represented by this square. And this represents feelings victorious over the material world. So maybe something material was holding you back from a partnership or marriage, and this represents overcoming that obstacle. And there's the nice addition here of some roses in the Crystal Tarot, which fits. So eights are balance. This is emotional balance, or the age of reason. Nines are a fully formed concept. So this represents respecting family traditions and caring for others. Now 10 can be overabundance or complexity to the point of instability, but in the case of cups being such a beneficial suit, it just represents the most complex emotional state, which is friendship. And surrounded here by some roses of Venus. And the Crystal Tarot as well. So yeah, this is a good card, friendships. Again, the courts are pretty typical. The butterfly here, he does specify, represents sentimentality. And it's interesting here that the checkerboard is included on the Crystal Tarot, that representing planning and intellect. So this one might be a little bit more supported by the structure of a plan. The Knight being a romantic seeking love, probably. The Queen's Cup is held up by eagles with a Libra sign, very airy, also with some fire, probably representing some passion. That's not really specified in Eudes Picard's book, though. So this is the Chalice of Aquarius watering the ground. So in the King, even though the cups are an air sign, we do get some water representation as well. And his pickaxe represents work, and his scepter, intelligence and will, which is topped off by a butterfly, which is Psyche. This one's a little more complicated, so I'll just read it for you. A standing king holds in one hand a pickaxe turned toward the ground, and in the other a scepter topped by a butterfly. In front of him is a cup placed on a pedestal. 4 streams of water come out of the cup, forming the sign of Aquarius and fertilizing the earth. Intelligence and will, symbolized by the scepter, must be at the service of effort, the pickaxe, to fertilize any enterprise. The luck that comes from above is only ephemeral or sterile if it does not find a counterpart of guarantee represented by work, which nourishes and gives it stability. You see that represented quite beautifully in the Crystal Tarot. So, swords are water in this system. And as I mentioned before, Christine Payne Towler goes into some detail in her book about her thoughts on that and how water, as opposed to air, just represents, the different undercurrents and doesn't necessarily affect the superficial meaning, more just the cause behind the meaning of the sword, or of the sword suit. And she also mentions that she believes Eudes Picard was influenced by a particular philosopher in astrology at the time. And she goes into detail on that in her book. But Eudes Picard's definition of swords is resistance and struggle, and the ace being the fundamental principle of the suit. This just means a fight. In all of the aces, he considers the hand or arm to represent action. The moon and the crustacean both represent invisible difficulties and obstacles to overcome. And you can see the Balbi Tarot here just sticks with the more typical Marseille style ace here. The 2s being opposition. This is a rupture or a duel. Here, the leaves sinking down represent death, because that's what these leaves do when they die. And the fish floating upside down also represents death. This card gets a little bit more realistic. It's kind of like the development of evil and the attack against morals. And I think this is one where Christine Payne Towler has some good insight to clarify a little bit. Consensus fails, relationships end in strife, diverging worldviews undermine discussion, lotus leaves sink to the murky depths of the pond, inability to talk things through to a satisfactory conclusion. So you can see she's still bringing in the element of intellect to the sword suit, which Eudes Picard doesn't do. But, that brings a little bit of clarity, and there's nothing wrong with that. So the 4 of any suit for Eudes Picard represents the materialization of that suit. Here, the materialization of struggle and resistance is an attack. And we've got Cancer up here, but also surrounded by Scorpio. And Christine Payne Towler makes the point that the astrological symbols in this deck are not really organized enough to be a system. So that leads me to believe they can be read just as any other symbol. So he describes Scorpio here as an evil water sign. Kind of like I, the Capricorn, am an evil earth sign. So this is the realization of evil on all planes. He does mention that the card is bounded by, or the water is bounded by moons, which he represents surrounding the water like this, and Maricciugula represents above the water here like that. Christine Payne Towler brings in the mental aspect again. Negative thinking produces the outcome it fears. So again, the realization of evil. So I think you can see why I can't really recommend a single book on this deck, because all 3 of these help with the explanation. The all-seeing eye, or the eye of God here, represents conscience or morals. So 5s represent domination of, and in this case, morals or conscience, one's conscience or divine aspect is overcoming the negativity of the swords, which here represents remorse or even moral punishment. And here's an example of where it's not a very dogmatic, systematic use of astrological symbols. We've got Aries, as well as Cancer. In Maricciugula's deck, they're more like goat heads, but it's supposed to be Aries, a ram's head. We have 2 opposing triangles here, pictured a little bit differently. in these two, but representing the same, opposition or indecision or hesitation in the sixes. The zodiac signs represent the struggle between emancipation and servitude, or between freedom and necessity. His meaning is an undecided state of health or dependence. Curious about Maricciu Gula's definition. Dependence on others, indecision, a solution found after much worry, problems and difficulties resolved, a sea voyage or a trip. She keeps bringing in the ocean, kind of literally. Upside down, bad management or lack of initiative may lead to loss of property. Temptations and unexpected development, carelessness causes illness, a declaration or a confession. So she brings in some elements of Eudes Picard's meanings, but gives it a little bit more detail based on her experience. And you can see here that Aries is still represented in the Crystal Tarot, but a little bit more abstract in nature. Quite beautiful. And while the Balbi Tarot differentiates a lot in the shape, it still tends to bring in a lot of the symbolism, especially the above and below type symbols. So sevens represent victory or success. In this case, the success of the wicked. He does specify temporary success, at least. Shady undertakings. So here we have darkness represented by the moon, overpowering the light of the sun. The cold moon, mistress of the nights, shines over the sun, which sinks into the depths of the water. This is supremacy of darkness over light. He considers this to mean armed robbery or betrayal. So 8 here, as with the others, being balance or justice. And justice in the face of the negativity of the swords, or what he would call evil, is the sanction, represents the sanctions of justice. So his meaning is condemnation. Christine Payne Towler goes on to say, exacting examination, confrontation with truth, being weighed and measured with the same standards one holds over others. No one is above the law. Stop making excuses. Here, the plants are out in the air, out of their element, and the fish are facing upward, trying to jump out, also getting out of their element. And I want to compare this. This is another example of where I think the Thoth was influenced by the Eudes Picard deck. This is 5 of Cups, but we have plants out of their element for sure. And this was, a very early system that was developed and was influential on the later traditions. This one's a little complex, so I'll just read from Eudes Picard here. 4 swords in a square on the bottom of water hold 5 swords in the air, forming a pentagram surrounded by water lily leaves. 2 fish with their heads turned toward the surface of the water seem to want to jump out of their element. It represents the attraction exerted by the spirit of evil, which is 5, which is more represented by the devil, the number 15, which temporarily prevails over its realization, in other words, number 4, materialization. This card applies to the revenge planned in seclusion and measured by patience. It also expresses feelings of hatred and envy. It summarizes what evil expresses on the plane of concentration. It therefore marks the pause between intention and act. That's interesting. And you can kind of see that, especially represented by the fish. They're pausing before they jump out where they're not supposed to be. I'm curious what Maricciu Gula has to say. Number 9 is usually the concept of the suit fully developed over time, which in this case is pretty much just evil or wicked deeds. When this card is drawn right way up, grief caused by bereavement, much moral suffering leading to an isolated life, perhaps in a convent, misery, despair, tears, worries for a loved one, injustice, intoxication, hatred, and envy. When it's upside down, suspicion, calumny, rumors, shame, punctiliousness. Wow, she's quite verbose. I like how the Crystal Tarot just adds in a nice little couple of water lilies there. The 10s can be an abundance or even an overabundance or overcomplexity, leading to instability. So kind of that end of the cycle, beginning of the next cycle kind of thing. But with the cups, we had it, they were pretty much pure good. The most complex relationships being friendship. And here we have just the opposite, where we have the 10 is just pure bad complexity, so representing enemies. Also an epidemic or contagious diseases. The moon in its 4 phases represents the mobility of evil. It's the extreme variety of all the different kinds of evil and the threats hanging over our heads. Christine Payne Towler's take is interesting. The endeavor has ended. Complementary opposites have lost touch with each other and become enemies. This is the card of the end of the road. Now the cycle is complete and the only action possible is decomposition, preparatory to starting over. So she kind of goes into more of the cyclical nature of the 10, but incorporates Eudes Picard's meanings as well. So the valet here is kind of a scheming guy, this checkerboard representing a plan, tactical nature. And we saw the checkerboard included in an earlier valet in the Crystal Tarot, but this one is a little bit more negative. He can be something like a spy or an intelligence worker, whereas Picard tends to consider the quartz to represent people. Maricugula gives more divinatory meanings, so the prudence to combat those spying on you, a vigilant, a spy, a soldier, perhaps a bodyguard. When it's upside down, it's a plot, an unforeseen occurrence, a lack of defenses, or an attack by night, a person who is powerless in the face of strong forces, a weak or feeble person. So she gives it a little bit more variety by adding more general meanings in addition to descriptions of a person. So this knight, represented by Scorpio, the more active water sign, and struggling through water, which here represents resistance. And he's considered to be something like a religious fanatic or somebody that's, going against the grain. Christine Payne Towler's definition is interesting. Danger to those who enter the water in armor, kind of taking it pretty literally. Hidden currents can sweep you away. Know the tides before an attack is planned. Invisible forces can interfere with even the best laid schemes. Both the king and the queen are riding on top of a moon. She's more deceitful, maybe vengeful. He has a medallion with Jupiter on it. She has Cancer, of course, represented there. And he represents, according to Maricugula, power, authority, the law, strength, an active, just man with great intellectual powers of an analytical type. So she's kind of using more of the mental meaning of swords, unlike Eudes Picard. He can also represent a enemy or a lawsuit, conflict, something like that. But really, Eudes Picard encourages us to divine our own meanings. To kind of take what he's written and develop as readers on our own. He says, when one reads about different methods, it is natural to wonder whether the adoption of too many procedures will not sow some confusion in the spirit. A book can only be read in one way, but it can be commented on in many ways. The same is true of the tarot. One will work wisely by developing it as simply as possible. The difficulty will be in the interpretation. So he mentioned earlier in the book that he could write pages upon pages on the meanings of each card, but instead he kind of gives you a little bit to work with and provides ample symbolism in order for us to develop our own reading methods. So as far as the books that I recommend to help in reading with the Crystal Tarot, the Synthetic and Practical Manual of the Tarot by Eudes Picard is probably my top recommendation, but you noticed some of his meanings are pretty scant, and he did that kind of on purpose. And both Christine Payne Towler and Maricugula fleshed out the meanings a little bit. Maricugula tends to bring in more commonly accepted viewpoints into her meanings. Christine Towler does the same, but also includes some, additional aspects like the 10 categories of being by Aristotle and things like that. So she also provides more context and history, but layers on a lot of her own philosophy, which is not without criticism, but I think, again, is really interesting. Pretty much anybody who writes about the tarot layers in a lot of their own thoughts and conclusions, which I guess you just kind of have to with a subject, you know, as ephemeral as the tarot. So the new edition of the Crystal Tarot, which has, you know, bigger cards that are more visible, a nicer box, and an expanded guidebook, will be out very soon. And I will be back with a follow-up on this, incorporating whatever I learned from the expanded guidebook and talking some about the majors as well. I sure appreciate you joining me today. Thank you so much, and I will see you next time. Bye.